Greetings, everyone. Please have a seat. We're going directly to this next panel. My name is James Fallows from The Atlantic. I'm making a return engagement after the panel yesterday afternoon, and this has been a fascinating sequence of panels this morning as it was yesterday. I'm going to spend just a minute trying to provide some connective tissue between where we started yesterday, where we're going the rest of today, and what I hope we're going to learn in these next few minutes, which I'm really looking forward to. For reasons I'll explain to you in a moment, I will not be able to be at the end of the panel later today. I have a good excuse. I will just tell you in a moment. But what I would say if I were going to be around then is how impressive it is that all eyes forward, please. Yes. So how impressive it is that the people planning this conference, this gathering, it's been as if there were an actual strategy here, an actual way in which we're trying to have us share things we've learned, we wonder about, and move on to action long term. We've heard from people from a wide variety of backgrounds. We've had technologists, we've had people at national level politics, international level politics, local level politics, activism and engagement of all kinds. We've had scholars, we've had lawyers, and there's a range of 20 other categories we've heard from. And they've shared impressions of the ways in which the technology of this moment, how we communicate with each other, how we communicate intimately and in large scale, is changing for better and worse the fundamental things that people have always tried to do, tried to govern themselves, trying to understand reality, trying to protect individuals or failing to protect individuals, trying to separate signal from noise when it comes to perceiving the world around us. Yesterday, Eric Schnur properly corrected me in my attribution of the quote that I was saying from Herman Talmadge. It was actually George Smathers, of criticizing a political rival by saying that his sister was a known thespian. Here's actually a correct quote that applies to what we're doing. This is from Adlai Stevenson, back when he was running for president. He said the role of the role of editors was to separate the wheat from the chaff and then print the chaff. So this is a long-standing challenge in our business. And we've had analyses of the challenges we are dealing with, but we also have had suggestions of what to do in this new environment, this fast-changing environment, how people in the different sectors we're talking about, the faith community, the university community, politicians, technologists, how they could try to use this clearer understanding of where we are going to steer things towards a better direction of outcome. And that is, I think, what we're going to do in this panel as well. Here is the plan of battle for the next session, separating us from lunchtime. I'm going to ask each one of our panelists to talk in a first round about understanding what's happened to the question of truth, reality, and I'll give a little more setup of that. That first round will be understanding what has happened to us. The second round will be what we can do about it, sort of a diagnosis and then prescription. At 12 p.m., at 12 noon sharp, I'm going to pass this microphone to Eric Schnur, our host, who will, we've been longtime friends, so he will moderate the audience question stage of the conversation. The reason I am doing that is there is a young woman whom I met when we were both 18 years old. We've been together ever since then, which is now 50 years. And I need to be in D.C. this evening for an event honoring her. And so the only thing would make me, I have to get the 1 o'clock train, or the 50-year run of being together with my wife Deb may come to an end. So at noon, this seat will be occupied by Eric rather than Jim. But for the next while, I'm here. I'm going to ask my panelists, who I'll introduce you in a moment. We're going to talk about a very specific part of the sort of understanding reality challenge that has run through this conference. We're talking about truth and falsehood, not as a matter of proportion, what gets more attention, what gets less attention, not as a matter of just attention or distraction or how our psychologies are being changed by our technology, nor strictly of polarization, but about simple truth and falsehood. The stage where, compared even to other eras in American history, one could argue that there's simply more falsehood by metric tonnage than there's been before, and it's harder to perceive what is the actual reality. And so we'll see whether that assessment is true and then what can be done about it if it is true. And we're going to go in this order for the discussion. We have three eminently qualified people. Jennifer Kavanagh of the RAND Corporation has written a recent book, co-author of a recent book called Truth Decay, which has some obvious resonance with the problems we're discussing. She's going to give us her brief summary assessment of where we stand on the truth versus decayed truth front. You'll recall that yesterday Kathleen Hall-Jamieson used her phrase VD for viral deception. We'll see whether that resembles or not what Jennifer Kavanagh will tell us about. Then Angelo Carusone, who's been involved for a long time with Media Matters and for the last 2 years has been president of Media Matters, who is involved in trying to combat the media spread of falsehood, will give us his assessment. And then Professor Robert Shapiro from here at Columbia, who has written an eminent political scientist whose recent book, one of his recent books, is called The Rational Public. He can tell us whether that is still a viable way to describe our reasoning public. So with that, let me turn it first to Jennifer to give us her overview of the truth versus falsehood state of affairs.
Okay, thanks. So truth decay is the term that my co-author Michael and I are using to refer to the diminishing role that facts, data, and analysis appear to play in our policymaking process, in the way we talk to each other, and how we talk about political and social issues. Now, the reason that we initially were concerned with this comes very much from our business model, which is RAND provides research and evidence to policymakers. If research and evidence and facts don't matter anymore, then what is RAND really supposed to do? So that's how we started here. But obviously, there are much bigger consequences to than just to RAND. This has consequences for our democratic institutions and our society more generally. So one of the things that we wanted to do with this project was to take a holistic view of this problem. So we didn't just look at media, we didn't just look at political polarization, or just look at education, or just look at the internet. We wanted to understand how all these things were fitting together to cause this more systemic problem that we were observing. And so that was how we approached this. So, how would we define truth decay? We defined it as comprising 4 specific trends. The first is an increasing disagreement about objective data and facts. Examples here would be disagreements about the safety of vaccines or evidence on climate change. These are areas where we have overwhelming body of evidence in support of one interpretation or one set of facts, and yet an increasing number of people disregard these facts or question them. Second, a blurring of the line between fact and opinion, and an increasing relative volume of opinion compared to fact. So it's not just about the increasing amount of falsehood, but also the way in which opinion is mixed in there. So it's difficult for a reader to determine what's a fact and what's not. And then finally, trust in institutions. We see a real decline in trust in institutions across the board, especially those institutions that we used to look to for facts, data, and evidence. So we end up in a situation where not only are we not sure what's true and what's not, but we're not even really sure where to go to find that factual information. So what do we think is causing this? And I think this gets it to the question of what's wrong, or how did we get here? So the first is actually something that hasn't changed, and it was really the focus, or one of the focal points of the first panel today, and that's cognitive bias and the way we process information. We like to be right. We seek out things that prove that we're right. We disregard things that say that we're wrong. We rely on our friends and family, which can be great if you have informed friends and family. Not everyone has informed friends and family, so it can be dangerous. We use shortcuts to make decisions, which can be helpful, except when they lead us astray. So there are all these ways in which just the way we process information makes us susceptible to this. Now, that's not new. But the internet and the social media and the changes that we've seen in our media ecosystem, which is our second driver, really exacerbate those trends. And so here I'm talking not just about social media, which we talked heavily about in the last panel, or even the digital space, but some of the changes in the traditional news industry that have been driven by the rise of the internet. So we have increasing number of different sources, increasing intensity of competition between traditional media outlets, the decline in the sustainability of the traditional investigative journalism model, which maybe my co-panelists will talk a little bit about, so I won't focus on that. We also have a democratization of the information space generally, and that's a good thing, right? We should want more people to have access, but with it comes unintended or unexpected consequences, difficulty determining what's high-quality information versus what's low-quality information. So we have this space that's increasingly difficult to navigate, increasingly difficult to figure out what's a fact and what's not. Now, the third driver that we point to is the education system. So as technology has changed the way information is shared and disseminated, it's become increasingly challenging for people to navigate that space. But technology changes fast and institutions change slow. So schools haven't caught up in terms of providing students with the skills they need to be able to navigate that space. And this is also true of adults, of course, who weren't taught how to use digital media in school because digital media didn't exist, and who we have much smaller avenues to reach now that they're out of school. So there are a couple of reasons here why the education system is important. The first has to do with what I pointed to here, this gap, this slowness of change. The second has to do with resources. We don't provide schools generally with enough resources to invest in revising and revamping their curricula, making sure teachers are prepared to teach these skills to students. And schools are facing an increasing number of other demands, providing before and after school care, doing 1,000 standardized tests each year, right? So they already face these demands. And then the final piece here is that I don't think we've yet really dug into what it means to teach someone to be digitally literate or media literate. We throw these terms around, and there's a sense that we just teach people, how to use Google better. But that's really not what media literacy is about. And so, we could have a whole panel just on that. And so those are some of the challenges there. And then finally, polarization. And we've alluded to it here several times in the political space. But it's also important to think about social, economic, and demographic polarization, and the extent to which we live and work in very homogenized communities that are then separate from these other communities. And these create the demand for alternative narratives as well as the space for these alternative narratives to thrive. And so this is, I think, some of the drivers that end up getting us to where we are today.
Jennifer, thank you very much for a masterful job of distilling in just a couple of minutes the arguments of a whole book and the surrounding work. Angelo, now tell us how we should think about, tell us the Media Matters perspective on where we stand on the truth versus fiction frontier.
Sure. So right after the election, I moved into this role, but one of the things that we did, part as just an exercise that sort of turned into something significantly more meaningful, was we took 60 or so of the most trafficked fake news stories from the past year and a half. So Obama bans Pledge of Allegiance, Hillary Clinton is on a breathing machine, things like that. Pope endorses Donald Trump. We traced them backwards. We did a food chain analysis. Where did they start? And what we found is that they all started in the same place. And what came out of that was important insight, not just into how this sort of disinformation engine spreads a lot of these falsehoods and why they're so effective in some ways, but something more meaningful that gets to what do you do in an environment where there's all these issues around trust and truth, and how do you combat that? So what the takeaway was sort of a framework. They all started in these online message boards, places like 4chan, 8chan, Kiwi Farms, some smaller white nationalist message board communities. They would create the raw material that ultimately became fabricated stories. A Craigslist posting that they went and put in there, I'm George Soros and I'm hiring people to go protest Donald Trump. Screenshot, post, there's your evidence that all the protesters are paid. That becomes a major story that ends up in an outlet called the San Francisco Chronicle Gazette, not a real news outlet. And boy, does that sound real and go viral. So what happened, we found, is that these communities were creating a lot of the raw material that then was moved into a pipeline of not just ideological storytellers, so traditional misinformers, but also people that were just looking to make a buck off of some viral traffic. And they were distributed through a constellation of mostly ideological social networking communities. So I don't want to get too much into the weeds on that, but broadly speaking, it's sort of message board communities, raw material, storytellers, distribution networks, social media. Why this is really relevant to this inquiry, though, is that one of the hallmarks of the community at the bottom that was creating a lot of this like the raw material is that they also engage in concerted harassment and abuse. The Gamergate was referenced before. That is sort of a pretty standard play. You just target people with all these harassment and abuse. You troll them, you dox them, you release their private information. There's a net effect of that, though. And that's that during the 2016 cycle, and Pew did some studies on this, but there are others, they all show the same trend line. 44% of people that identified as left of center did not really engage in political or civic conversations on their social media feeds. meaning they didn't post a lot of information about it. That number was only 8% on the conservative side. So almost 1 out of every 2 people that identified as left of center was kind of tuning it out. Now, it's not to say they didn't care. When you drill down as to what was the motivation there, most of them would do it in really small circles. And the people that were most likely to tune out were not the diehards, but the ones that were sort of more toward the middle, the ones that had the most persuasive power over their social networks, the people around them, their community. And that's where it gets to this issue of truth, because on the one hand, the engine that is driving so much of this disinformation was doing something even more damaging and lasting to the structures of the way that we communicate. Word of mouth is still the most effective form of advertising, and it's by far and away the most effective form of transferring information. You might reject facts, you might not care about the specific data points, but the narrative, the part that validates and reinforces your worldview, that you get from your peers. And so if you are able to create a mechanism by which you allow for people to consistently withdraw out of fear of retaliation, harassment, abuse, or you make them feel impotent, that their voice doesn't matter, whatever the motivation is, you actually create a pretty clear landing strip for a lot of lies, disinformation, and misinformation to disseminate. And that's how you get to a place, when you add it all up, where in London right now, in the span of just 2 years, their vaccination rates for MMRs have fallen below World Health Organization levels, and they could not believe it and do not fully understand how that could happen until you look at the engine here, which is that you get a bunch of message board communities just making up fake anecdotes. You get it spreading far and wide, so it feels very real. It feels like a legitimate, your own social networks are sharing the story about somebody who claims to go to the school of where your other kids go, and it has a deeper resonance. And you create a system where anyone will get abused and harassed if they push back against it, mostly through bots, but regardless. And you get a scenario where behavior changes really fast. So broadly, that's how we see the state of play right now, and a really significant countermeasure and safeguard against for truth has largely been neutralized as a consequence of this process.
Great, thank you. And again, it's fascinating, and as if somebody had planned the lineup of this panel, that we've had, the sort of landscape ecosystem analysis from Jennifer, and then the very specific description of what's happened, in weaponized political opinion in the last 2 years from Angelo. Now we have the academic perspective from Art Shapiro. How should we think about this academically?
Well, the academic perspective is the political perspective. The focus that I would like to emphasize is on the role of partisan conflict and polarization in terms of fomenting the spread of fake news and lies. And however, things aren't as bad as they seem. And I want to cite, hot off the press, there's an article in Science that I got yesterday. In terms of the pervasiveness of fake news, and this is in cyberspace, and we can come back to mainstream media. It's an article on fake news on Twitter during the 2016 election. And the takeaway is only 1% of individuals accounted for 80% of fake news source exposures, and only 0.1% accounted for nearly 80% of fake news sources shared. So the scope of the problem here, at least in cyberspace of fake news, is much more limited than people think. Although small percentages matter if you think about influences on the election outcome in Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. So small differences matter, but in the grand scheme of things, it's small. And the article also emphasizes where the real action is in mainstream media. So think in terms of Fox News and liberal media here. Now, what I would emphasize here, now this fake news that we're talking about, which Kathleen Hall Jamieson very nicely referred to, she didn't like the term fake news because she thought that was a contradiction, but she liked the expression VD, viral the deception, and that seemed to catch on yesterday in a big respect. For me, there are two aspects of lies that are important. They're the kinds of lies that we see today that have proliferated in politics, including the elephant in the room, Donald Trump, obviously on steroids here. Those are blatant, outright lies, which has been refined a little bit in Roger Cohen's assessment of it and his citing of Harry Frankfurter's book on bullshit. That is, Trump is more of a bullshitter than a liar in the sense that a liar knows what the truth is and lies about it. A bullshitter doesn't care what the truth is. It's just trying to make his case, like Trump did in the State of the Union address when he pointed to the fact that El Paso, Texas, put up a wall and the crime rate dropped. Well, that wasn't quite what happened. The crime rate had dropped, the wall went up, the crime rate was steady and actually ticked up a little bit. Trump probably heard El Paso has a wall, crime rate's low, made the causal connection and causal story. These things are troublesome, but they're less troublesome, and this speaks to the solution here. These are lies where the liars know that they're lying, they know what the facts are, and then the critics of the liars know what the facts are, and they call them out. And we've seen a proliferation of the calling out of lies, all the fact-checking and so forth. So that these are lies that are countered and are potentially neutralized in public debate. And that applies to liars and bullshitters alike. That leaves open the possibility that over time, and this speaks to the solution, because this is the only solution I have, is that over time the public will get is wising up about this. They know that they can't believe everything they hear, especially from partisan sources, and they go for, and unavoidably, I think, they are exposed to a mix of news where eventually they pick up the truth. Now, it may take a longer time rather than a shorter time, and people are not as cocooned as some experts have argued about. That is, and there are studies that actually show that people actually are exposed to things inadvertently, and they do broader media searches. The kinds of lies that I worry about most are the lies that have always been with us, and I've kind of talked about this in other contexts. And these are damn lies. The difference between lies and damn lies is that in the case of lies, the facts are out there, and the opposition can report about the facts and debate them openly because of free speech and freedom of the press. Damn lies are lies that occur where the liars lie and the critics are suppressed because free speech is suppressed and the media are suppressed. So take Nazi Germany and the rise of Hitler, or take what happened in Turkey and what Maduro wants to do in Venezuela today. The damn lies that I worry about most, and this hasn't changed, are lies in which the liars have a monopoly over the information. They know what the truth is. The opposition doesn't have information. That is, the information here is asymmetric rather than symmetric. Only one side has it. And here, this has come up in American history going back to the explosion on the ship Maine that led to the Spanish-American War. FDR's deception of basically having a destroyer go after German submarines prior to the war and claiming that we weren't involved in the war. How we got into the war of Vietnam, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and how the alleged attacks on the destroyer as well didn't quite play out the way Lyndon Johnson said, and in fact he and the intelligence community knew about it and lied about it. Weapons of mass destruction leading to the war in Iraq and so forth. And then today, and then this is where I'll close. The cases that worry me is when I see the intelligence heads testifying in Congress, and they're asked about whether there was Russian involvement in the election, whether the Iranians are complying with the agreement that Trump has dropped, and thus far they've told the truth. That is, they've told what they think the facts tell them, as opposed to what Trump and the administration wants to fear. But had they said the Russians had not interfered in the election and the Iranians have not complied with the act, I would be worried.
Thank you very much. There's an important issue on which I'd like both Jennifer and Angelo to respond, because there is one implicit difference in perspective among the panelists where Robert Shapiro is not saying, oh, calm down, but he's emphasizing the feedback self-corrective potential within today's info sphere and political sphere. I'm wondering how each of you responds to that. Would you agree with him that we shouldn't exaggerate the effect of public fiction, and we should pay more attention to the natural feedback? Jennifer, why don't you start?
So one thing that we did in the book was to look back over U.S. history since about the end of the Civil War, and try to identify other periods that look like today, and try to see whether we could find evidence of the four trends that I mentioned previously in those periods, and then try to see if we do find the evidence of it, does it end? And so the answer is, we find evidence of three of the trends in the previous periods. What we don't see is this willingness to throw aside facts and data. There's always been skeptics. People have always been skeptical. If you take the example of vaccines, there has been skepticism and anxiety about vaccines and their consequences since vaccines were invented. But what we see now is an increasing amount of evidence about vaccines and an increasing number of people saying that they don't believe it. So it's this divergence that we point to. So that's distinct about this period. Now, if you look at why these other periods ended, it's kind of hard to tell, but in a lot of cases, it's because of some kind of disaster or catastrophe. You know, like the Great Depression, when people realize, oh, maybe we should actually use macroeconomic data to make economic policy. You know, so that, you know, that's what ended one of the periods in the 20s and 30s. And if you look back at the 80s and 90s, you know, the Spanish-American War didn't end it, but it certainly motivated journalists to get down there and figure out what's actually going on, and let's return to facts. So is there a chance that this could self-correct? Yes. I mean, I think a thing that has motivated these types of trends in the past is new technology. And the period after new technology comes to the fore, those periods are messy. And they're messy because we don't know how to use them. We are still getting used to what that means for our personal relationships. We don't have the institutions to govern and to manage those spaces. So there's a chance that that happens with social media, and we naturally go back to something that's good. My concern, though, is that instead of that natural path, we end up with some kind of really like reaching rock bottom, and that's when things turn around. And so my motivation in continuing to work on this project is to try to identify what are the ways that we could get out of this, what's the exit ramp before the catastrophe, if such a catastrophe is coming. And so that's the way I kind of think about this.
And Angelo, before turning to you for that, let me thank and congratulate everybody who's put this conference together, and thank the three panelists, and welcome Eric to the chair. But how do you feel as Media Matters as part of the self-correction?
I don't think the threat can be exaggerated enough, to be honest. And I, on the Twitter point, that's well taken. But a very, very small amount of information consumers and distributors use Twitter. If you look at Facebook, starting in June of 2016, the aggregate reach of all of these disinformation sites exceeded the total reach of all news sites on Facebook combined. Actually, a threefold increase. I mean, it's incredible change in the distribution networks, and that is really the lens through which most people see the world. And that's and there's plenty of other data there. So I think that's one element to it. On the self-correcting front, I'm not henny penny about it. I think there are real meaningful solutions. Why I'm less, I think we have to be really intentional about the self-correcting is that in the past, the self-corrections were the economics. So one of the things that helped self-correct the news industry was that they went from a paperboy model where you had to sell your papers every day on the street, so therefore you needed these outrageous headlines because to a subscription model. That provided a steady revenue stream. It allowed for journalistic ethics and the profession to really turn into a profession. It allowed for not everything to be so sensationalized, whereas the economics here are the opposite. They incentivize the very worst. They incentivize disinformation. They reward it. And they reward the bad behavior that actually then turns into this feedback loop. And that's where I worry a little bit about the self-correcting mechanisms. And you know, whether it's the MMR example or the resurgence of flat eartherism in the States, I mean, you can see this engine having a real meaningful effect on the change in behavior. And the self-correction is going to require just a little bit of a tip, I think, because it's against the economic headwinds.
Add one thing before we move on. It's really important to note that when we're studying these trends and we talk about what we know about how people share and use information online, we're almost always talking about Twitter, because Facebook really doesn't share its data or make it public to researchers. And that's a concern, because most people are on Facebook, and as you just mentioned, the Twitter population is pretty small. And so Facebook is working with researchers now to try to do a better job of sharing their data, but we still don't have the papers from that research. So most of what we know about how things spread online is from Twitter, and that's not necessarily a representative sample.
Yeah, the other things to keep in mind with regard to the self-correcting mechanism is that people are still predominantly getting their information from sources other than social media. That is, the mainstream media are still just edging it out. The one murky area is that sometimes the mainstream media are obtained online rather than in front of the TV, et cetera, et cetera. The other self-correcting mechanisms is, one, people's attentiveness to information and politics more generally. It's much more limited than is widely thought of in these kinds of circles here. The other is people have prior beliefs and are often difficult to persuade. So even given exposure, whether people are persuaded by this new information is up in the air. And then third, and this is the great unknown, we can talk about American society today, but in thinking about the future, we need to think specifically about how new generations wrestle with these problems of new technology and information, and whether they learn how to sift through this very complex information environment and come to rely on sources that are providing good information rather than lies.
Well, I had no intention of sitting in this chair until about an hour ago when I found out Jim was going to be leaving early, so I have 0 prepared questions. So I think this would be a good point to open it up to the audience, have you ask questions, and when those run out, we'll come back for one more round of commentary from the crowd here. And I'll just comment as Lacey circulates the mic that, okay, we've got a question up here. This whole conference is intended to be a conversation, not just that we're all talking at you. So this is a great opportunity for us to take about 20, 25 minutes here for you to ask questions, and then after that we'll go to lunch where you can corner these people and ask them even more questions. So anyway, we've got one here, and then we'll go to you next. Go ahead. You kind of have to like look at it 3 times and then it works.
My question is, this whole discussion is U.S. centered. What's about international? Europe, China, data, information, if you have. How do they behave? What is the reaction there?
I have one thing to add on that. The underlying mechanism is the same, at least with respect to message board communities, that they're a little bit ahead of us in every way. The one thing that's really different abroad that I think will become more of an issue here is the utilization of chat apps as sort of functional community. Here it's like Facebook groups are there. In the UK, for example, people under the age of 25, 15% of them cite WhatsApp as their primary source of news. It's basically just a group chat. That is a really big difference compared to the States, and how it has implications for how you monitor it and how you combat it. But it's probably the single biggest difference that I could point to. Same trend. I mean, the London example is an example of the sort of the fake news crisis moving, and that's everywhere. I would say it's a little bit ahead. Most of the new experiments and the new forms of disinformation tend to happen internationally before they come here.
Yeah, so we just started looking at these same trends. Like, our book was totally focused on the U.S. We started there. We can only take on that as a first cut. We now have a project where we're looking at what it looks like in Europe and trying to understand to what extent they are the same trends or different trends, the same drivers or different drivers. And it looks really similar. There's a lot of the same elements. There are some things that are different, especially the way politics plays in is different because those political systems are different. They have different laws, so they have different flexibility or a different willingness to regulate. So they've taken different steps in terms of dealing with social media companies and disinformation online. They are incredibly concerned about disinformation coming from Russia and Russia's interference in their elections. And so it's something that they think about all the time and are a lot more proactive in terms of trying to get out there and think of solutions that they can implement to protect their elections, especially the upcoming European Union elections. So I think it's a lot of the same dynamics. It plays out in a little bit of different way because they have different institutions and different structures and different legal frameworks. But I think it's 100%, we're very accurate to say that these foreign disinformation has been a problem in Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, well before it was something that we were even talking about here.
Hi, I completely understand the concern about disinformation and fake news versus real news, but who gets to be the arbiter of what's considered disinformation versus truth?
I think that's a tough one. I mean, the line that I use is, for me, the stuff that I try to focus on the biggest problem first, and then deal with as we get closer to the margins, the gray areas. If we can't deal with something as basic as Obama did not ban the Pledge of Allegiance, if you post a fake proclamation, that's just totally fabricated. That's a real dangerous piece of disinformation. Or when Donald Trump during the campaign went to a white nationalist message board community, his social media director did, a guy by the name of Dan Scavino, and plucked an image that had that purported to come from a think tank of which did not exist, that had crime statistics, black on white crime statistics, all fabricated and made up. that was completely, there was nothing remotely truthful about it. It was totally made up. That I would say, that's the big stuff, the things that have no basis in truth whatsoever. There's not a different interpretation of it. It's not a debate about the implications of a policy. That's the stuff that really concerns me. Mainly, not just because of the past. I think about it for the lessons of the future, and it was mentioned earlier. That's how we get to things like synthetic video, fake audio. That's going to be the real crisis, and to me, I would focus on the stuff that is really clear-cut for now, because that's how you make big policy changes at the platforms, and then you can debate about it. If it's debatable, then we probably shouldn't be talking about it, at least in the context of fake news.
Angelo, let me follow up on that. You said that there are things that are so obviously false that they're dangerous. Is there anything that's so obviously false that it's obviously false, and therefore it's not dangerous? We don't have to worry about it?
Oh, boy. That's a good one. I don't.
This is where politics comes in, right?
Yeah.
So I think there are things that are so obviously false that we would think they shouldn't be dangerous, except that there are actors in the system, and no matter what the information is, there's almost always some actor who stands to benefit from spreading that and getting people to believe it. And there's always someone who had this little inkling that was going to happen, and they see it online, and they're like, aha, I knew it. It was true, right? So I think there's information that we think should just be like, everyone's like, oh, of course that's false. But in the current environment that we live in, there, especially in the United States, because there are these political dynamics that create incentives to do this and economic incentives to do this, that's what we see happen. And social media is such a powerful tool because it's not just, word of mouth is definitely the best advertising, but you can only tell so many people. On social media, I can tell millions of people in a second. And so that's why I think that this is a problem that's always existed, this idea of there being false information and people using false information. It's just that now we see it on a totally different scale, and it becomes that much more dangerous. It's like an exponential increase.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask a question about self-correction. I'm inclined to agree with Professor Shapiro that the best way to counter false information is with the truth. But recent studies have indicated that it doesn't work that way, and that the refutation of falsity with the truth may actually serve to increase the belief in the falsity by giving it a greater publicity. I was wondering if you could address that concern.
Yeah, that was discussed this morning, based on experiments where partisans were given corrective information, and they became even more partisan as a result of that. But my point is that we're talking about how this plays out over a longer period of time, where the process of lies, counter arguments persists until the hope would be that the truth would win out. In terms of instantaneous corrections, I don't see any way of doing that in any kind of instantaneous fashion.
What's the evidence that's positive on the long term?
Well, what's positive on the long, I'll just, a very specific example, the 2018 election versus the 2016 election. QED.
See, I've actually thought a good amount about that issue, and I was thinking about this as we were listening to the panel over the last hour. I taught a class about a year ago that essentially tried to draw parallels between the natural world and human affairs, to encapsulate it very briefly. And I've had two conclusions about this. I think that most social processes follow an evolutionary process like in the natural world, and that things are good, and so something naturally arises to attack that. Over time, there's a response that corrects for it, and overall, things eventually solve themselves and work out okay. There's two problems with that. One is that's a long-run process, and as Keynes said, in the long run, we're all dead. Our problem is what's happening right now. The second thing is it doesn't always work out that way. In fact, every stable natural situation has a disease state that eventually evolves into chaos. Everything, even the most stable natural process. It's just a matter of how often it happens. And the research shows that essentially the occurrence of bad things in human affairs, like Nazi Germany or something like that, the intensity and the frequency with which things like that arise essentially follows the same mathematical model as earthquakes and other natural phenomena. There's lots of little bad things that come along. There are really, really big bad things that come along sometime, and it's essentially unavoidable. At some point, everything is going to spin out of control. And our job as human beings, basically, is that unlike earthquakes, which just kind of happen, we do have some ability to at least put that off another day until the bad thing happens. So we can act to improve that situation. But the bottom line is there's things. I believe things will probably self-correct in some fashion, but there's a good chance that they will not. They're certainly not going to happen tomorrow. It's all contingent on what we do, and that gives us an obligation to do what we can to bring things back under control and keep them from spinning out of control as much as we can. And that's essentially why we're here, this conference.
Yeah. I've got a question actually about hope that would hopefully will, if the answer is where I hope it is, will instill some hope for all of us, which is that some of those phenomena seem to be lined up more to one side of the political spectrum than the other, and there are clear demographic lines in terms of age groups that align to those particular things. So is there actually any demographic data as to whether there is more of a spread of untruth in one particular segment of the population from an age group standpoint versus another? And if it is so, I hope that it is more among the older crowd.
So on the demographics in terms of age, I wish I could tell you a more hopeful story, but it's not all that hopeful. I mean, there's really no relationship between believing false information and age or education, which is surprising. In fact, some of the people who are most willing to hold on to something they believe, even though it's wrong, are the people who are the most educated. Probably because they feel very confident in their knowledge, even though it's wrong. So, in terms of those demographics, we really don't see that relationship. If you look at, there's a recent paper that suggested that older people are much more likely to share false information online, which might suggest that younger people are better at distinguishing between fact and fiction online because they've been using it longer. But again, that's using Twitter data, and we'd have to kind of look at it on other platforms to understand the extent to which that actually captures things well. Young people don't really use Twitter anymore. They use, Instagram and Snapchat and closed messaging apps and things like that. So. I'm just not really sure there's the evidence to back that up. That said, this is a question that I don't think that we yet really have the data to study in a really rigorous and systematic way. So it's possible we'll learn something that's more hopeful. I think that believing false information is something that doesn't discriminate, really.
Other question in the audience?
Hi.
Where'd the microphone go?
Yeah, sorry. Hi, my name is Sanjay Jolly. I'm a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania. I think there are sort of a handful of folks who, whose thought is along the lines of, fake news or not, the media has been lying about my community forever. And so I'm wondering if, to the extent that you all think that the recent fixation on viral deception and fake news kind of obscures kind of the more general failure of American deliberative public culture.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think it's because, I think the reason why the term fake news caught on, and it sort of gets to your question in a way, is that Donald Trump didn't popularize the term fake news. He hijacked it. Fake news caught fire after the election because we needed something to describe what we just experienced. And the idea of calling it misinformation or lies or untruths, it didn't feel right because we knew it was something distinguishable than the kinds of stuff that we typically, even the kinds of misinformation or lack of full picture that we get from the news media. Like, we knew it was distinct and different. And part of it is reflective of, so it's more like describing a phenomenon. And that's largely why it caught on, because we collectively understood we needed something different. And that gets back to the question, which is they're different problems. One is a question of inclusivity in the newsrooms, the kinds of editorial policies that they have, how they make their decisions. A lot of them are suffering and are being hollowed out increasingly, and so they are responsive more so than normal to what's happening online. I mean, Gannett, for example, has this policy. If they have a Twitter tracker, if something gets enough tweets, it goes around to all the editors. No big deal. That's okay. But they also have an editorial policy, which is that if it exceeds a secondary threshold, you must write an article about it. Doesn't matter what it is. That is a policy that Gannett has. And that's why you see those stupid roundup posts a lot. Here's what all the people on Twitter are saying about this thing, because that's their easy way of getting around that policy. So a part of it, and why I think they intersect, is how you deal with it from a traditional newsroom perspective. Is there's a structure and a mechanism by which needs to be improved and addressed, and that's through advocacy, watchdog work, and a whole bunch of other things. The other thing, though, this is something materially different. It's about sort of a gaming of the refs on the social platforms, and in some cases an enabling of it. And total fabrications are a lot different than, say, omitting a full story or misrepresenting. They're much more insidious in some ways, especially given the way that they're distributed in sort of a viral way. And that, I think, is it's a fair point. I just think I'm not saying, I don't think one is necessarily more important than the other. I think they're just really different problems that kind of got blurred together, because it's the information ecosystem, really.
Yeah, the
Unfortunately,
bias is...
I don't think we have any time for more questions. So I want to get everybody onto lunch and onto what we're going to be doing after lunch. So we'll do another round back through the panel. So Bob, why don't you start us off?
No, I just wanted to comment further. I think the biases, media biases here at work are in the favor of attracting audiences, and that usually means what's new, what's surprising, so there's an economic angle that's at work here.
You have a concluding wrap-up you'd like to give us?
No.
Okay. Let's go to.
I don't want to keep people from lunch.
I want Jennifer to round us off. So, Angelo, any friends?
So the one thing I would say on a wrap-up is there are solutions. Try to go to Facebook and upload your favorite movie. Can't do it. And that's because they put in place countermeasures to prevent you from stealing and sharing intellectual property. There are mechanisms that we can, and solutions already in place that can be applied to this problem. If we think about the totality of what I've discussed and what we talked about here, is where does this lead? How do you solve the next crisis and prevent it? Fake video, you do a similar thing. You put in place the countermeasures on the front end so that it does not have the destructive and powerful effects. If you know that the overwhelming majority of true disinformation is starting elsewhere and doesn't reach the social platforms until 3 or 4 weeks after it started there, improve your AI so that it is looking at those chans and those message boards first to help you get indicators for the kinds of disinformation. There are real structural improvements here that can be made to both prevent the real next crisis and improve the rules of the game.
So I also wanted to wrap up by talking a little bit about remedies. I think you can put remedies into 3 buckets. There's supply side, there's demand side, and then there's policy. So on the supply side, I think we need to think about different ways, different models for news production. The current model for investigative journalism is not sustainable. We need to think about different ways to produce news, whether that's crowdsourced or philanthropically funded. What does a sustainable model for journalism look like? So that's one thing. Another thing is thinking about ways that media companies could do a better job of distinguishing for readers between what's opinion and what's fact. Even the best newspapers now blur the two. And I think that's really misleading for readers, and it contributes to this problem. Even if we're not talking about falsehood, the blurring of fact and opinion, I think, is a problem. On the demand side, we need to teach people how to use these different tools, how to navigate the information environment, how to synthesize and create and share and act on information, given that the dynamics are so different now. And then in the policy space, I think there's a number of things that we could be talking about, and I want to kind of tie back to what ended the last panel, this discussion about regulation. I don't think the discussion about regulation should be regulation or no regulation. Those aren't our choices. Our choices aren't nothing and Ministry of Truth. Our choices are in this gray area between. We have lots of different models for thinking about how we manage information and different kinds of spaces. And we've been really, as a society, really creative in coming up with these different ways to deal with all different types of information, different types of institutions. And so this is why I like to talk about media governance. What do we want? The internet and social media provide us with incredible tools, and they're really powerful and valuable. They have unintended consequences. What do we want that space to look like in the future? That's the discussion that we should be having. That's the data that we should be focusing on collecting and studying so that we can understand the dynamics so that we can get there in the future. And that I see as a really hopeful story. We have a chance to really create something powerful both for ourselves and for generations to come. So I would end it.
Before we thank all of our panelists, I want to say something real quick about lunch and what's coming after. As I said before, a big part of the idea of this conference is interaction, and you'll have a chance to do that over lunch. these panelists, most of our panelists from the morning and from yesterday, and the ones from the afternoon who you haven't heard from yet, are all going to be out there. So this is your chance to buttonhole them and ask them questions and continue the conversation we've just been having. We've got a whole array of food out there. I want you to enjoy yourselves. I want us to start back promptly at 1 o'clock because we've got a couple things coming up this afternoon, including our great technological experiment. We have a speaker appearing live from London. I don't know if this is going to work. Hopefully it's going to work. But if it does work, it's going to be because we do this exactly on time. So we're going to need to get moving. We've got a great speaker coming up right after lunch, and then our speaker from London. So I'd like everybody back in the room at 1 o'clock. I'm told that you can bring food here, except that I'm not supposed to encourage you to do so. But if it happens, it's okay. Just don't think it's the greatest thing to do. Okay, go out there, eat. 1 o'clock, we'll be back here on the dot. Thank you.